Equations involving inverse trig functions. Today we're going to be talking about various different types of equations that have trig functions in them. Solving an equation for a specified variable. We're going to solve each equation here for x. So in this first equation, y is equal to 5 times the cosine of x. In order to isolate the variable or to get x by itself, the first thing we need to do is divide both sides of the equation by 5. Alright, so that gives me y over 5 is equal to cosine of x. Okay, and then remember to get rid of a trig function, or to undo a trig function, we can take its inverse. So we're going to take the inverse cosine of both sides of the equation. And cosine inverse and cosine just cancel each other out. So now we have cosine inverse of y over 5 equals x. So that's our goal, is to get x by itself. So we can either write it like this. Another way that this could be written is x is equal to cosine inverse of 1/5 y. So either way, either notation for the cosine inverse would be acceptable. Alright, in the next one we have 2y is equal to cotangent of 3x. In order to get to the x, we have to start with what's farthest away from it first, so we got to start with that cotangent. And to undo cotangent, we're just going to take cotangent inverse of both sides. Alright, so I'm just taking cotangent inverse of both sides of the equation. Alright, so cotangent inverse and cotangent would cancel each other out. So now I have cotangent inverse of 2y is equal to 3x. And then I divide both sides of the equation by 3. Alright, so then I have cotangent inverse of 2y over 3 equals x. Or I could pull that 3 out in front and have it as 1/3 times the cotangent inverse of 2y, and that would also be an acceptable way to write this. Okay, we're still solving each equation for x. Here in C, the first thing that we need to do is get rid of that 6 that's in front of the sign. So I'm going to divide both sides of the equation by 6. And now I have y over 6 is equal to sine of x over 4. Okay, so the next step would be to get rid of the sine, and we would do that by taking the sine inverse of both sides of the equation. Alright, so I'm going to take sine inverse . Okay, so sine inverse and sine would cancel each other out, and I'm left with sine inverse of y over 6 is equal to x over 4. And then to get x by itself, I would multiply both sides of the equation times 4. The 4's would cancel, and I'm left with 4 sine inverse of y over 6 equals x. Alright, in D we have y is equal to 2 sine of x minus 4. So remember, we always, when we're trying to solve an equation for a specific variable, we undo addition and subtraction before we undo multiplication or division. So since I have that minus 4, the first thing I'm going to do is add 4 to both sides. And that gives me y plus 4 equals 2 times the sine of x. All right, so my next step would be to divide both sides of the equation by 2. And I have y plus 4 over 2 equals the sine of x. And we know to get rid of sine, we're going to take its inverse. All right, so that would cancel. And I'm left with sine inverse of y plus 4 over 2 equals x. All right, in this next set of directions, it's solving an equation involving an inverse trig function, and they want us to solve each equation for the exact solution. So this first equation is negative 4 times arc sine of x equals pi. Well, remember that arc sine means the same thing as sine inverse. But before we can get to that, we need to get rid of that negative 4 that's being multiplied times the arc sine. So we're going to divide both sides by negative 4. And now I have arc sine of x is equal to negative pi over 4. Okay, so since arc sine means the same thing as sine inverse, the opposite of that, or the inverse of that, would be the sine. So we're just going to take the sine of both sides of the equation. So sine and arc sine cancel each other out. And I'm left with x is equal to the sine of negative pi over 4. All right, so they want the exact values, or the exact value, or the exact solution for each value. Okay, so sine of negative pi over 4 is negative square root of 2 over 2. So this would just equal negative square root 2 over 2. All right, for B, we have 4/3 cosine inverse of y over 4 is equal to pi. All right, so the first thing we have to do is get y by itself. And 4/3 is being multiplied times that trig function. So in order to get rid of that, we're going to multiply by its reciprocal. So we're going to multiply both sides of the equation by 3/4. All right, so when I do that, the 3/4 and the 4/3 cancel each other out, and I'm left with cosine inverse of y over 4 is equal to, that would be 3 pi over 4. Then to undo cosine inverse, we're going to take the cosine of both sides. All right, and so I'm left with y over 4 is equal to the cosine of 3 pi over 4. Well, the cosine of 3 pi over 4 is negative square root of 2 over 2. Okay, so we have negative square root of 2 over 2. And then to get y by itself, we're going to multiply both sides of the equation times 4. So that gives me y is equal to negative 2 square root 2, because the 2 and the 4 would reduce. And that's my answer. Okay, we have one more. This is cosine inverse of x is equal to sine inverse of 3/5. Okay, so first we need to get the x by itself. So to get the x by itself, you might not be sure about which trig function to take, but since we're trying to get the x by itself, we're going to get rid of that cosine inverse, so I'm going to take the cosine of both sides. So cosine and cosine inverse are going to cancel each other out, and I have x is equal to cosine of sine inverse of 3/5. Well, this is saying the cosine of the angle whose sine is 3/5. Well, we know that if the sine of the angle is 3/5, that would be, this would be my y, this would be my r. Okay, so this would be a 3, 4, 5 triangle. So we know that x would be 4, and we know that cosine is x over r. So that makes the cosine of sine inverse of 3/5 4/5, because the cosine of that same angle that has a sine of 3/5 is 4/5, and that's my answer.